certainly a good thing with today's scriptures that God encourages us to ask hard questions. Because the two primary scriptures for today present hard questions and give no answers. It's a little bit intimidating for me to stand up here on the platform and raise these questions, because being up here sort of implies that I have an answer, and I don't. The first question that I want to raise this day for us to consider is the atonement. Atonement is the healing of the rift that exists between human beings and God. Ever since the Garden of Eden, when the serpent said to Eve, "Oh no, you won't die if you eat this beautiful piece of fruit. God just doesn't want you to become like God." And Eve believed that God had lied to her, and so she took the fruit. Ever since then, there has been a separation, a gulf of sin between human beings and God. And atonement is the healing of that break, that rift. How is atonement accomplished? God gave the Hebrew people a number of different avenues to erase sin. But the problem is that sin never stayed gone. They went to Jerusalem to sacrifice 3 times a year at least. And in the moment of the sacrifice, your sin was gone. But pretty quickly thereafter, it began to accumulate again. An understanding of sin that they had back in that day was that sin was like a creature, a being of some sort, an entity or a power, a darkness that could settle on a person or corporately on a people or a kingdom. And you had to drive that creature away. But somehow it always came back. They had the scapegoat, and the priest would lay hands on the head of an animal and put the sin of the people on that animal, and then they would drive it off into the desert. They had the offerings of the animals at the temple, and also offerings of grain and other things that people could bring. And for at least a little while, your sin was sent away from you, departed from you. You also there were rituals. John the Baptist wasn't doing anything startling or new when he was baptizing people with water. There were rituals for cleansing and purification that you would get in the water, you would wash, you would be clean, and that lasted until sin settled on you again. With the coming of Jesus, the atonement becomes permanent. But how does Jesus atone for the sins of the world? It depends on who you ask and which of the church fathers and early church mothers and theologians that you want to sit down and read. It depends on which of the epistles you read. Some say that God required a sacrifice of blood to atone for sin. And we have that. If you take up your hymnal, you can see every variation on atonement that there is in theology in the hymnal. There's substitutionary atonement. The sin of human beings being so great that God required a sacrifice, a huge sacrifice, a sacrifice of blood to atone for that sin. But if you look at the Old Testament, that doesn't necessarily make sense, because God has never asked for a human sacrifice. God has, in fact, God saves Isaac and provides a sheep for the sacrifice. In the one instance where it could be made an argument that God asks for a human sacrifice. The other gods of the peoples around the Hebrew people frequently asked for the firstborn child to be sacrificed. And people did that. To Molech and to Baal, they sacrificed their own children to appease the gods. But God, Yahweh, has always been different, has never asked for anything like that. So, does God require Jesus to die because God requires a human sacrifice so powerful that only God himself can provide it? Some people argue, yes, that the lamb that God provides in this case, as God provided the sheep, the ram in the bush for Isaac, is Jesus, the lamb who takes away the sins of the world. Other people, on the other end of the theological spectrum, would argue that the atonement takes place because human beings needed to see just how far they had fallen from God's purpose and intent. How far we came from God's vision for who we could be. And so, only the act of trying to kill God was big enough that it could shock us into seeing how far we had come from who the Creator made us to be. Only something like seeing God himself on the cross and knowing that we had done that would be enough to bring us to our knees, to make us ask for healing and forgiveness. What do you believe in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection achieves the atonement, the healing of the rift of sin that separates us from God? You can look through the epistles and you can see that even in the earliest church, there was no specific agreement. No one said, this, smack, is how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection heals the sins of the world. But everyone agrees that by faith in him, whosoever believeth in him, then that rift is healed. If you look at the person in the pew next to you, chances are good they believe something very different from what you believe about the atonement. It's a very personal thing. And you have to arrive yourself at some understanding of how Jesus takes away your personal sins before you can really accept the scope of what he has done for us. But there's no 100% answer to the question, how does Jesus take away the sins of the world? Which leads me to the next and even harder question. And it is the question that led to the title for today's meditation. The Psalm 121, is a psalm of protection. It says, "From whence does my help come? My help comes from the Lord. The Lord will not let your foot be moved. The Lord will not slumber. Behold, the one who keeps you will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your shade. The sun shall not smite you, nor the moon. The Lord will keep you from all evil." If that's true, why do terrible things happen to believers? Why do God's people suffer? It's going to get worse. The Matthew story is a story of dreams. There are actually 4 dreams. The first occurs before we start with the reading, and it's the angel to the wise men. And the angel warns them that they shouldn't go back the way they came, that Herod was going to try and track them to find the newborn king. So they go back home a different way, by a different road. And this so upsets Herod that he decides that he's going to kill all of the male children in this entire area, 2 years old and younger. But an angel comes to Joseph and warns him that he and his family need to flee to Egypt. And so they do. And the child is saved. And while in Egypt, Joseph dreams again and understands that it is now safe for him to go back to Israel. But he hears that the ruler currently is not one who is likely to have forgotten his father's grudge against this potential threat, political rival, a new king. And so, yet a third time, the angel warns him, and he's sent to Nazareth with his family, where they are safe and the child grows. 3 times, 4 times, if you look outside this lection, God intervenes and preserves the life of the infant Jesus. Why doesn't God preserve the lives of all those little boy children? The children of Rachel, weeping and wailing in lamentation, and refusing to be consoled, for they were no more. Certainly God could, and the psalm says, the Lord will keep you from all evil and will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in. Again, the Isaiah passage, his love and his pity, in them they were redeemed. Why doesn't God intervene and prevent this massacre? More personally still, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do some people get miracles and other people don't? Why do some people get what they ask for in their prayers and other people who pray just as ardently and fervently do not? Good questions. 14 years ago now, I was witness to a tragedy in which a child was killed. And her little brother said, "Why did God take my sister away?" And I don't know, 14 years later, if he really ever came to an answer. I haven't asked him if he has an answer for that question. But I know that the parents did everything they could to keep their child safe. She was in a car seat, a booster seat, properly restrained in the back seat. Mom looked both ways. The car came over a hill, speeding 30 miles an hour faster than the speed limit, and just T-boned them. Mom got the child out, preserving spinal integrity, and performed CPR, and she was a doctor, Mom was, so textbook CPR, but nothing she did could make a difference. And I'm sure that she prayed. And why do some people? It's a miracle, they say. We could have been killed. We should have been killed. Why for some people and not for others? That question is very deep and very personal to each of us. The question of our salvation is somehow more academic to most of us. It doesn't necessarily matter how Jesus atones for the sins of the world if we believe that he does. But these other questions are questions we're almost afraid to ask because it seems like we don't have enough faith. And maybe we were praying wrong. Maybe it's something we did wrong rather than something how could we blame God? Well, the answer is it's nothing we did wrong. There is no answer to that question in this life. But there is this, and this is from Hebrews 2:18. And whenever I find myself getting angry with God and asking those really hard questions, I think about this passage that Paul uses when he's talking about the atonement. You see, these two things are connected, but not necessarily in the way that I would sit down and say, oh, the atonement, well, now it makes sense. But here is chapter 2, verse 18 of Hebrews. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. I don't know why some people have miracles. I don't know how Jesus affects the atonement in such a way that the rift between human beings and God is permanently healed by simply our belief and faith in him. But I do know about Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus himself suffered in every way that we can suffer. He was betrayed. He was crucified. He saw his friends disappear over the hill in his time of greatest need. God lost a son and didn't intervene to lift Jesus from the cross. God tells us that in the last days, he himself will wipe away every tear because God knows what it's like to cry. Emmanuel, fully human and fully divine. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. I don't need to know, although I really want to, and sometimes it makes me angry that I don't, why some people are tested and some people have miracles that take the test from them, at least at that time. But I do trust and I do know that no matter what happens in life, God is present there with us to bring us through it. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Hebrews 2:18. Amen.